Welcome back to another episode of What's That Sound? I am anything but miserable today because we're going to be looking at my favorite band's drum sound, Paramore, breaking down their song, Misery Business.
Zac Farro was the drummer. The producer was David Bendith. It is crazy bombastic sounding. We're going to figure it out.
For our drums, we used our trusty 70s Gretsch kit, and for our snare, we actually had a Ludwig Supraphonic. For our crash cymbals, we used a Zildjian 20-inch Crash Ride and a Zildjian K Cluster Crash, also 20 inches. And then for our hi-hats, we have 14-inch Zildjian K Dark cymbals.
All right, so this drum sound, I think it defined a lot of like really modern rock drum sounds for like a decade afterwards, right? I think it's still influencing a lot of people's idea of what enormous rock drums that are also like very pop oriented, not terribly like unhinged. They're bombastic, but they're very, very controlled. And that is really, really popular now. And I feel like this was one of the early records that like kind of defined that sound. The keys to this sound are the reverbs and the compressors. There is not a ton that is terribly different in this sound than it was from the sounds of like a decade earlier that were doing rock sounds. As far as placement, as far as microphones, all of that stuff is relatively similar. However, the way that they were compressing this stuff was pretty different. The way that they were mixing it was pretty different. The reverbs were a little bit different. And those things together kind of made like a larger than life sound, right? It feels much more processed, much heavier, much more in your face than stuff would a decade earlier. All right, so kick drum, really run-of-the-mill setup. We have a 421 on our kick in. We have a FET 47 on our kick out. The kick in mic is capturing the attack. The FET 47 is capturing all the body. We are doing a little bit of processing on that with our SSL, right? We're adding a little bit of EQ, just kind of scooping out the mids and boosting up the lows a little bit. And we are adding a little bit of compression and a little bit of gating on that. Outside of that, it is pretty much processed the way that you would process any kick drum sound in a rock setting. For our snare drum, we have a 57 on the top. We have a 414 on the bottom. The 414 is like a bit of a bigger snare drum sound for the bottom snare. It has like extended highs. It has kind of extended lows when you compare it to like putting a 57 under there. The reason that we did this was because we knew that there is a lot of high-end length that was going to come from this snare drum, right? We used a snare drum that had really kind of long ring in the snares itself, and the high end just adds this kind of energy that is really, really exaggerated. And so to further that, we really heavily compressed the bottom snares. With bottom snares, we used a fast attack compressor. We used our SSL, and we compressed it so you don't get a ton of the actual attack of that drum, but what you get is this kind of halo of like high-end energy that lasts much longer than the snare top microphone would last. And it starts to kind of meld with the reverbs and just makes this kind of gunshot feeling where every time the snare hits, you get this burst of high-end white noise that just lasts for a few seconds. toms, basic, straightforward, 414s, really nice, high quality condenser microphones. We used a little bit of EQ, just scooping out some of the low mids, and we also filtered a little bit so that they were not extending too low and interfering with the kick drum. We added a tiny bit of high end too, just to get them to cut through. On overheads, we used our trusty Schoeps V4Us. They're really, really balanced microphones. They just kind of sound the way that, you know, your ears sound in a lot of ways, and they didn't take a lot of EQ. We added a little bit of super highs, and we also scooped out just a little bit of the like harsh mid-range stuff that comes with cymbals sometimes. Outside of that, we used a little bit of compression, but nothing too crazy. So for the room mics, we used Coles 4038s. These are dark microphones. They work really well with bright rooms that are really bombastic, so that you don't have to like EQ it too much to control the cymbals in them. And we put them in a Blumline pattern. We ran them through a Chandler TG1 compressor. This is set to limit with a fast release, so it just brings out all of the like energy, all of the little nooks and crannies of what's happening in the room. It just brings it super to the surface. And as soon as you add in this microphone, you start to get this added length on the snare drums. You start to get this added energy in the cymbals, all things that were super necessary for the sound. Now the things that are really, really making these drums sound the way that they are. They used reverbs on this, right? That's nothing too different than what they would do in any other decade, but the difference is that as opposed to like the sound of a 90s record, where the reverb was a really big part of the sound, you wanted to notice that this reverb was happening. In this record, you wanted to feel the reverb energy, but you don't necessarily want it to sound like someone stuck a big 90s reverb on it. And the way that they managed to do this is through multiple reverbs, and they're using them with different stereo formations. So on the snare drum, they used a reverb called the Yamaha SPX90. It is a really, really like classic grunge reverb that they used a bunch in the 90s. We have the one that came after that, which is an SPX 900, but they have a couple similar algorithms. The sound of this is kind of bad, honestly. It's like a kind of dumb sounding reverb, right? It's really bright, it's really weird sounding. It's, you know, some of the snare drums in the 90s sounded really bright and weird, and this is kind of that. And the only difference is that rather than running this in stereo, we ran it in mono, right? It's a stereo reverb, we just panned them centered. And what this does is it means that you can't differentiate the reverb from the snare drum itself. I mentioned that the snare bottom is getting compressed really heavily so that it adds this like high-end white noise burst, right? Now that white noise is getting mixed in with this reverb, and they both have this kind of bright white noise effect to them that adds this length to the snare drum. And normally that would be kind of cheesy feeling, but because it's mono, you can't tell them apart, right? There isn't this sound of a snare drum and then this like stereo white noise thing that is like really kind of artificial feeling. Instead, it just feels like there is added length just to the snare drum itself, and it's a little ambiguous where it comes from, but it all melds together and feels enormous. On top of that, we added a very kind of quintessential 80s reverb, which is an AMS RMX16. This is the sound of like Prince. This is the sound of a bunch of things that people think is gated reverb is actually this reverb unit. We had it set to the ambient setting with a 1 second reverb tail, and we had it darkened quite a bit. And that was in stereo, so this was actually adding the depth to our snare drum. We had the length from the mono reverb, we had the depth from the stereo reverb, and together they just create this kind of beautiful, larger than life snare sound. To tie this all together and really add energy to it, we had to add a compressor. David Bendeth was really generous with the information that he gave about how they did this sound. So we knew that they were using a Compex limiter. It's a very, very specific compressor. It has a really, really fast attack. And the reason that that's important is that the smack of this sound is entirely dictated by this parallel compression. That is the thing that is making it feel like it's not overly transient like some things might have been in different decades. It's really, really controlled, really, really slick sounding, really modern sounding. A lot of that is just this compressor. Another significant thing about the way we did this sound is we compressed the reverbs in with the drums. I don't know if that's actually what they did, but to me, because these reverbs feel so transparent and they feel so gelled in with the rest of the drums, it feels like they all got compressed together. So the last finishing touches on this, we added a little bit of Valhalla room just to add some extra depth to the snare and toms. And as was the case with a lot of rock records at the time, it sounds like they were probably using just a little bit of samples. So we added some samples to the snare just for that extra touch. That was the drum sound for Paramore's Misery Business.
As always, let us know in the comments what other drum sounds you'd like to hear us break down, and we will see you next time.